The United States of America has been blessed with the greatest Constitution ever written. It established a balance of powers between the states and the federal government, enabling us to be protected in our rights without being abused. In the words of former British Prime Minister William Gladstone, he described the U.S. Constitution as the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. James Madison described the balance of powers that was established by the Constitution in this way. He said, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain with the state governments are numerous and indefinite." Now, this statement seems a little foreign to us today, where our federal government's powers are far from few. They seem to be involved in virtually every aspect of our lives. In fact, today we see a great growing movement across the country of people asking, how do we rein in the federal government to get back to the constitutional few and defined powers that they were intended to have? Across the nation, we see numerous solutions being proposed. One such that we are starting to hear more and more people talk about is the Article 5 Convention. Found in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, it is often also referred to as a Constitutional Convention, Convention of States, or a CONCON. But in Article 5, it refers to it as a convention for proposing amendments. Various amendments are being discussed right now that could possibly rein in the federal government. And so various groups are now proposing to state legislatures, trying to sell this idea. We need certain amendments and we could rein in the federal government. And one of the most notable topics is a balanced budget. Today, though, I wish to speak about some concerns I have about this process. Those that are advocating an Article 5 convention, typically in their zeal to promote this idea and sell it to state legislators, overlook and don't mention certain bits of information, historical facts, that need to be considered in order for state legislators to make a well-informed decision on this process. So today, we'll talk about the Article 5 Convention and especially, what are they not telling you? This will consist of 4 parts. In Part 1, we'll examine 4 conflicting approaches to the Article 5 Convention. We find that even those that are promoting the Article 5 Convention don't agree with each other on what is truly the constitutional yet safe way to call for an Article 5 convention. In Part 2, we'll examine what Article 5 really says, and then compare it to the claims being made by those promoting the Article 5 convention. Then in Part 3, we'll cover the 1787 precedent. In 1787, we had the Constitutional Convention where the U.S. Constitution was written, and it set a very interesting precedent. There's a lot of debate today on whether or not the 1787 convention stepped outside the bounds of their authority, if it was a runaway convention or not. In this section, we'll examine what I consider 3 indisputable facts that clearly define whether or not this convention was overstepping the bounds of their authority. And then finally, if we don't use the Article 5 convention, are there other solutions? Are there other possibilities of what we can do? We'll examine what I consider to be the true constitutional solution to our problems today. So with that, Section 1, 4 conflicting approaches to the Article 5 Convention. At the end of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, James Madison expressed some concerns for what was written in the Constitution. He felt one part of it was not fully borne out, wasn't fully detailed like it should be. In this, he says, relative to the Article 5 Convention, difficulties might arise as to the form and the quorum of the convention. How should this quorum be formed? Who should be the delegates? How should they be called? And so on. This wasn't spelled out in the Constitution. And he felt this could lead to future problems. There's some confusion over how an Article 5 convention should work. He was saying right from the beginning in 1787. That was never remedied. Today we see this confusion. The first group that I'd like to point out of 4 conflicting approaches is those who are promoting what I call amendment verbatim. They feel that an Article 5 convention is so dangerous, the only safe way to call for a convention is if we've already written the amendments ahead of time, leaving to the convention the job merely to vote up or down on whether or not to approve the pre-written amendments. Two prominent groups promoting this approach, Compact for America, and the other one is the Countermand Amendment. In both cases, they've already written out the amendment verbatim. And the states are supposed to tell their delegates, you're sworn to only vote up or down. You're not to change anything in this amendment. No spelling, punctuation, or anything. Now, with both of these, I would consider them to be the most constitutionally illegitimate proposals that are out there, because they're taking from the convention the only power the convention has, that of proposing amendments, and doing that job for them. Interestingly, the U.S. House Judiciary Committee agrees with me on this. In 1993, they published a report saying if state legislatures were permitted to propose the exact wording of an amendment and stipulate that the language not be altered, the convention would be deprived of this function and would instead become part of the ratification process. The Constitution gives the convention one power: propose amendments. And if we do that for them, what is their job then? So again, I would guarantee that if we were to call for a convention under one of those two, it will see lawsuits over it. And I'd be willing to bet that the Supreme Court would rule what I would consider correctly: the states do not have the power to propose the amendments. That's the role of the convention. Now, also interestingly, the other groups promoting an Article 5 convention agree with me on this, that that's not a legitimate way to call for a convention. So other groups propose it in other ways. For example, the next topic I would consider is the amendment topic. They will specify the amendment topic, but not spell it out in detail. They might give some of the specifics, but it hasn't fully been written. An example of this is the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force, where they have specified that the sole purpose of the convention is to propose a balanced budget amendment. They give some of the details of what it should contain, but they haven't actually written the amendment yet. Again, I feel this may be overstepping the bounds. It's supposed to be the convention that's proposing the amendments, not the states. But as they start doing so, some of the specifications they give might cause some significant problems. For example, with this particular amendment application, the exact wording says that in the absence of a national emergency, Congress must balance the budget. That's what they want in the amendment. Then unless there's a national emergency, Congress must always balance the budget. And of course, that would make Congress balance the budget when? When was the last time we had a national emergency? The answer is today. And every day since 1979. We've been under a constant state of national emergency since 1979. In fact, here we have a USA Today article talking about that. America's perpetual state of emergency, declaring that today we actually have 30 simultaneous national emergency declarations on the books. Now, the Balanced Budget Amendment in particular has some interesting history. Back in 1983, we almost had enough states applying for a convention for this purpose. It takes 34 states applying for the convention. We got up to 32. We were 2 states away from having this convention. And those promoting it say, if only we had gotten those other 2 states to apply, we would have balanced the budget. My answer is, when? Which years? Which years did we not have this escape clause apply? Well, none of them. There's not been one moment since we almost had that convention that it would have done anything for us. So on the one hand, if we were to have this amendment, at best I would say it would be impotent. It would do nothing for us. But worse yet, I feel like it could also do some harm. Here's why. What they are proposing to do is require Congress to balance the budget, right? If we look at what our current budgetary levels are, annual budget this year is supposed to be coming in right around $4 trillion. And the revenue, a little over $3 trillion. We're coming up short about $800 billion. And so, if Congress is operating with a balanced budget requirement, what would they do? Lower spending or increase taxes? Well, they could do either. I think they'll probably increase taxes. But let's just say they lower the spending to meet revenue. That would trim the federal spending by about 10 to 15%. Great. Does that help us? There's a third option here, besides just raising taxes to meet budgetary measures here, and that is the constitutional approach. The constitutional approach says Congress can only spend money on those things which are authorized by the Constitution. Notice that one's a little bit lower than the other two. In fact, by current estimates, it's about 20% of current spending levels. If Congress were to follow the enumerated powers of Congress and only spend money on what they're authorized by the Constitution, it would trim over 80% from the federal budget. We would have a budget surplus of more than $2 trillion annually, and we'd be able to pay off the national debt in just a few years. That's the constitutional balanced budget requirement that already exists. Now, if we replace that requirement with a new balanced budget requirement that simply says Congress can spend any amount of money up to spending all the revenue, we've now replaced the enumeration of powers. Congress can do anything they want as long as they don't spend too much money. You've now replaced this enumeration of powers and made spending all the way up to total federal revenue constitutional. But worse yet, if they raise taxes to meet current levels, you could now say that our current out-of-control federal government has become constitutional because they're not spending more than they're allowed to. We've replaced the enumeration of powers with a budgetary requirement. So not only do I feel that the balanced budget amendment requirement could be neutral, do nothing for us, it could also do tremendous harm. Let's go on to the next category here, and that being objectives specified. They're not saying what amendments need to be proposed, but here are the goals. Now, with the objectives specified, I feel one of the best ways to understand how this works is comparing it to something maybe all of you have experienced. A few months ago, I received a letter from my credit card company informing me, based upon your credit score and spending history, your credit card has been given a new spending limit. Based upon that wording, can you tell me whether they are raising or lowering my credit limit? I have a credit limit now, I'm getting a new one. Is that one higher or lower? Don't know. It could be either, couldn't it? When you have an established limit and you're establishing a new one, they might be expanding or reducing my credit. In the same way, we have the Convention of States application, which sounds limiting until you understand it properly, and that is, here's exactly what it says. They want amendments that will impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. Do we have fiscal restraints in the Constitution already? Well, yes, Congress is only allowed to spend money on things that are enumerated. If we're imposing new fiscal restraints, will those fiscal restraints be higher or lower than our current levels? Does this limit the convention to only reducing? It doesn't, does it? They could set the new limits higher than the present limits. Going into the second section there, they want the amendments to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Now, doesn't the Constitution already do that? And so if we already have limits to the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, will these new limits be higher or lower? The convention, at their discretion, could go either way, couldn't they? This is not a limited convention that they're calling for. They claim it is. And then thirdly, limit the terms of office of officials and members of Congress. What limits? 5 years, 50 years? Could it be limiting or not limiting? Yes, it could. This is totally at the discretion of the convention. Now, those that are opposed to the Article 5 convention always point to, for example, the fear that the convention will run away and exceed their mandate. Is that a concern here? I would say no. I'm not worried about the convention running away because they've already been authorized to do anything they want to. You could expand federal power. The Convention of States leaves nowhere to run away to. They're calling for an open convention disguised as a limited one. Now we come to the fourth category, which is a truly open convention application. A good example of this one would be Wolfpack, a group with ties to George Soros. And what they want to do is overturn Citizens United and make all elections publicly funded and so on. But in their application, the exact wording, it does talk about the amendment that they want. But when you get to the be it therefore resolved, they just simply say, the state of such and such hereby petitions the United States Congress to call a convention for proposing amendments. They say nothing about amendment topics or anything. Everything's on the table. This is an honestly open convention, no bones about it. Now, one of the prominent promoters of the Wolfpack Amendment is a Harvard law professor by the name of Larry Lessig. He's the founder of an organization called Call a Convention, as well as Mayday PAC. He was a 2013 Bilderberg Conference attendee, and he's also served as a campaign advisor for the Obama administration. Definitely a good resume for a strong liberal. And he has openly declared, for example, when he was asked about the 1787 convention, was it a runaway convention? Sure it was. And then he follows that up with saying, let's have some more runaway conventions. He likes the idea. In addition to that, he's seeking a truly open and constructive Article 5 convention. Open meaning no limits. Anything's on the table. Why? Because he says it's time to rewrite our Constitution. Now, maybe that's not all that surprising coming from a more liberal political perspective. But what is surprising to me is to find that he's also been working jointly with the leaders of Convention of States, traveling around the country, promoting the Article 5 Convention, helping them in their cause as well. And even more surprisingly, he serves on the Board of Advisors for Compact for America. Why would he be interested in helping them advance their conservative amendments? Unless, as he said before, it's time to have more runaway conventions. By getting them to their convention and then letting it become a runaway convention, he can get to his goal of rewriting the Constitution. Interesting strategy, and something we need to be aware of. Calling for any type of a convention, whether we believe it to be limited or not, can become an unlimited convention. We'll show more of that in parts 2 and 3 of this video. But in conclusion, James Madison again expressed some concerns. Shortly after the new Constitution had been proposed and ratified, there was a lot of talk about, well, let's use this provision of Article 5 to make changes to it immediately. He was very concerned about this effort. In a letter to Tuberville, as it's called, he says, having witnessed the difficulties and dangers experienced by the first convention, I should tremble for the result of a second. I feel the same way. That in today's situation, political environment and so on, I can't imagine anything good coming from a convention. So with that, we conclude the part 1. 4 conflicting approaches. They can't agree with each other on the proper and safe way to call for a convention. And I agree. I don't think there is one. Thank you.